thanks have to go to Lola and her team for setting all of this up, and Lola and Andrew very much for getting me here in the first place. It was quite hard, it's true. I was all over the shop, as you heard. Malta, London, Leeds, Prague, and now here. This is in a period of 3 weeks. Actually, I quite like this time of day, because this is 3 o'clock in the afternoon for my body, and I'm quite good at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'm absolutely not good at 9 o'clock in the morning, so thank you very much for the décalage, for the time change. The other thing that you might like to know, or perhaps you don't, but you're going to hear it anyway, because you're a captive audience, is that I'm half Canadian. Ah, Campbell, you know. Yes, thank you. Please do. My father was a Canadian, born in Toronto. And I came to Toronto, thank you for my dad. I came to Toronto, we all came as a family, for my 10th birthday, of which I have, as you may imagine, precious little recollection. What I remember was Niagara Falls that we visited, and a thing called a fudge-sickle. I don't know if they still exist, or if they do, they're probably just normal things, but I came from post-war England, where things like fudge-sickles did not exist. And this is my most lasting memory of my only trip to Canada, to Toronto, and Niagara Falls, all those years ago. Well, actually 55 years ago, if you want to know exactly. They've got the whole truth now. So thank you, Daddy, and I certainly do feel, well, I'm almost back home. And I think that's a great feeling. Now, on from the Niagara Falls and the fudge-sickles, and indeed my good dad, a Canadian musician, by the way, composer, another piece of information for you, Bruce Campbell. Bruce Campbell was very much behind my pursuing languages. He would have loved me to be a musician, and I wasn't bad, quite a good pianist, but not great. And so when I did languages, Dad said, well, all right, I suppose we'll have to just make do with her doing languages, but he loved languages as well. So here's my very short CV after the Canadian bit. I went to a school called Notting Hill and Ealing High School, a rather good and academic school in London, West London. Then I went to the University of Southampton. This is all in the 60s. No, I did not have tea with the Beatles, just in case you think I did. That's just sort of to sum up the 60s, as is the E-type Jag. And my very first job ever, and the best ever, sorry, the best ever, was as a disc jockey. I was a disc jockey in a student club in Freiburg and Breisgau, where I spent some of my study, if that's the word for it, so I didn't do much studying, but I learned German. And then I worked, after my graduation in Southampton, I went back to Freiburg and I started working as a disc jockey on the radio, local radio station. Now this may sound very frivolous in a nightclub and in a radio station, but as I always tell students at these many careers events that I attend and talk at, it was a very good preparation for my career. I was in a studio a couple of times a week trying to decipher what Mick Jagger was singing. We didn't have texts in those days. We had a thing called vinyl, black thing, records we had in those days, and no text. So I had to listen in a studio trying to decipher the words of I Can't Get No Satisfaction, for example. That's one I do remember well, into German, and translate it into German, and then do a voiceover. So you've got three things there: translation, listening to your own voice, because of course I listened, this is all pre-recorded. I listened to my own voice, and I got used to working with this, a microphone. So none of these things were a shock to me later. It was a great job. But then my parents said, look here, we've spent a fortune on your education, child, you can't spend your life being a disc jockey. Actually, I might have done, but anyway, I decided to do something a little bit more sensible and serious. So I went to Frankfurt, where I worked as a translator, German-English for a while, so I have my credentials as a translator, please note. And then I heard, or various friends of mine heard, that Brussels was looking for linguists. Linguists to recruit as translators, and then, as I subsequently found in Brussels, to train as conference interpreters. In those days, the European community, as it was then known, could not find enough English-speaking interpreters with the right languages and skills. Just couldn't find them. There weren't enough. And so they decided to do it themselves. And so the interpreters at that time embarked on a training course, a stage, as it was called, still known as well. And some of us were aptitude tested, of which more later, very important aptitude testing. And I was deemed to have the aptitude, and I was then trained for 4 months. 4 months I learned how to do correspondency, nervous breakdowns, hysteria, and all the rest about notes. And I say to them, don't worry about this. We go through how you take the notes, what the page should look like. This is not scribbling line after line, you know how they do. This is an open page with a margin, with the verb underlined, with who's doing what, how, and when. Those are the things we all know you have to note for consecutive. And then the last stage, and I'll say more about all these stages in a minute, is simultaneous, which quite naturally follows on. The same things are involved. You're going to be doing exactly the same thing, step by step. Now, not everybody follows exactly the same pattern. Leeds University, where I also teach, they start a whole week of only the background. What's interpreting about? Why do we have interpreters? What's the difference between translation and interpreting? They give them background reading. They don't do anything else. Strategies. How would an interpreter deal with X or Y situation? Public speaking. Just get up and speak, and get people used to that. Speech preparation. How to make the right kind of speeches. My God, they kill each other with horrible speeches at the beginning. So you can do all this without actually going straight into interpreting. It depends on the school, it depends on what methods they prefer, and everybody has their own ideas about this. The background reading is very important too. I have the most horrible experience nowadays of almost all students who don't read the papers, do not have much background, do not know what's going on. I'm not interested in economics, I'm not interested in politics, and I say, well, start being interested right now, and start reading and finding out what things, issues, subjects are about. Oh, I only like literature. Well, tough. That's not what this is about. Just tough. Then there are some people who will say, yeah, but you don't have to do everything in that order. No, there are the University of Aarhus, I'm pronouncing it badly, in Denmark, wrote to me to say, no, we start after the short speeches without notes. Everybody starts. Everybody. We go straight to sight translation and simultaneous. It's another approach. I would, personally not recommend it, but in that course they're also heavily focused on what I believe is the focus here too, public service interpreting. And so they decide this is the way around, and they bring the consecutive and notes in later. Anyway, students have to know what's the difference between what I call public service, community interpreting, we all have different words for this, and conference interpreting. I could go on for 2 hours on that subject, which I won't do, it's all right, don't worry, Lola. But there is a difference, yes, and they are equally valid. I'm a conference interpreter. I couldn't do the job of a public service interpreter, I'm pretty sure. A, I don't have a B language, and B, I would find the circumstances very difficult. So everybody has my full support if they are a public service interpreter. And I don't like this distinction anymore. I think we should drop it. We are interpreters. But you can quote me all you like. Now, I said simultaneous follows naturally consecutive. Yes, we've learned how to visualize, we've learned how to do little speeches. Then we've learned how to do notes. And we've suffered through notes, and we've got the hang of the notes. What are we doing all the time? Listen, analyze, note, for consec, reformulate, communicate. Sorry, but that is what this profession is all about, and nothing else. Whether it's with notes, consecutive, or simultaneous. Don't rush the students straight into anything. I think you do 3 weeks of short speeches, then you do 2 months of consecutive. And then, only then, when they're really, really used to the consecutive, maybe 6 weeks, do you think about putting them in the booth. This is my experience, and I have a lot of it. Don't overload them. Kids always want to go straight into the booth. Oh, let me get into the booth. or because they're going to be safe behind the glass. This is much nicer being here with lobs to play with and looking through the glass and not horrible teachers making you stand up in the class and so on. Little do they realise what's going to happen to them in the booth, of course. So we go on to, oh yes, the history. We have to have a bit of history. It is generally felt, it is generally stated, this sounds like a Jane Austen start, doesn't it? It is commonly, whatever the start of Pride and Prejudice is, believed that simultaneous began at Nuremberg. Actually, it began before that, as I'm sure somebody will point out to me. But just for the sake of argument, this is where we say it pretty well began. A very good friend of mine, alas is with us no more, Pat van der Elst, was one of those interpreters at Nuremberg. She, frightfully English, posh-speaking English lady, a real lady was Pat too. She said, well, we just got in there and did it. No business of trading. Trading for what? I said, Pat, it must have been frightful. Well, good, I mean, yes, you know, rather difficult going. And I'm listening, oh God, I talked to a lot of, when I first started, this generation, the first generation of simultaneous interpreters, was indeed working in the European Union as well. And Pat told me a lot about it. First of all, I was complaining one day about the working conditions, working with Pat. I don't know, I couldn't see properly, or my headset was uncomfortable. And she said, you should have seen what they gave us at Nuremberg. The things weighed a ton. That was Pat. Yeah, they just got on with it. All sitting, no proper soundproofing, all sitting behind a bit of glass with these hefty great things on their ears, and they did it. So please don't bang on children about working conditions. Those were the good old days. Now, everybody nowadays knows that interpreters work in simultaneous, but not only. We need simultaneous because it's quicker, because we've got 23 languages, we can't have 23 consecutives. It's very obvious. But in certain cases, quite a few cases, consecutive, I'm just saying this, they're not here, the United Nations, but let me just float this anyway. Consecutive is very important, and it will happen regularly through your career, wherever you work. In the EU, we use it a lot. I mean, when Mr. Gorbachev goes around the place, he has an interpreter with him, whispering probably a lot of the time, but consecutive. Negotiations, consecutive. Why? Because, as I've been told by negotiators sometimes, can you go slowly with your interpretation? It gives us time to think while we're planning our next strategic move. There are good reasons for consec. And then, you know, you don't always have headphones and booths everywhere. Two heads of state, what are they going to do? Consecutive. I'm just banging on about consecutive because it's, for me, the foundation of interpreting. It is where we should all be focused at the beginning, and we should never lose sight of it, whether we're in the UN or not. These examples are all where we see consecutive is used. However, both, as I said, are used. And if you ask most interpreters, conference interpreters, which do they prefer, they're going to say simultaneous, of course, because they're using it all the time, every day. We're practiced with simultaneous. We forget consent, get rusty. Still, we use it, we're used to it, but the students and those who are starting on it find it very daunting and very challenging. How am I going to manage to do this, they say. Well, I say, back we go to square one again. You listen, you understand before you open your mouth. Before you open your mouth, listen first, analyze, reformulate, to bang on terribly about reformulation and communication. The only difference between consec and simultaneous is that in simultaneous, you're doing the whole lot at the same time. The ultimate multitasking. So you have to learn techniques and methods to do it. Now, Dick Fleming, my good friend, gave me some good tips on this one too. He said, tell people, your students usually, don't be put off. It's hard to get to grips with the technique. Actually, it wasn't for me. I wasn't good at consecutive, but I just swam in the booth, so to speak. Can you say you swam in the booth? No, you know what I mean. I didn't find it difficult. I expected to, but it wasn't. You'll get there in the end. I had a colleague when I was training who was brilliant at consecutive. She just understood the mechanism immediately, fantastic. But she couldn't get to grips easily with simultaneous. Depends on the person. Getting people to speak naturally, visualizing the ideas again. Short sentences. I'm going to come back to the salami tactics time and time again. Cut up the sentence. And only open your mouth when you have understood. The temptation, again, especially in beginner students, is they hear something and they launch it. No, hang on a minute. Do we understand what that first sentence was? We don't open our mouths until we do. We work together with others. This is a big teamwork thing simultaneous to. And we always say to student interpreters and their teachers, never let a student just talk into the microphone without being listened to, ever. Ever. There is a point to doing this job. You are doing it for someone, communicating to someone. Doing it into thin air, they get into bad habits, and there's no adrenaline flowing, and you need that adrenaline. So that, I think, is very important when you're teaching it. Now, the issues, as we now say, and we don't have problems anymore, we have issues now. Split attention. I heard a teacher the other day bang on to the students about split attention. She kept saying, but this is split attention. I wanted to say, why don't you just shut up? They don't know what you mean. Explain what is the split attention and what's happening if your attention is here and there, and then find a remedy for it. Don't just use the word. Split attention, here I'm doing it. Anticipation, reformulation. I'm going to go into what they all mean though and how we deal with them especially. How to listen and speak at the same time. It's not a problem. Do you know what? It's not a problem. You get used to it. I should think quite a few people here can play a musical instrument. Well, you're doing lots of things at the same time. You're playing the piano, using two hands and reading and listening. Sorry, but there is no big issue, so forget the listen and speak at the same time. Absolutely not an issue. There is a problem with anticipation. Yes, you don't know what the speaker's going to say next. Great advantage to conseq, right? You've got the picture by the end of the speech. What happens? The good old German language. How many of you have German? Right. Well, I'm sure other languages have this, but German is my first language. The old nicht that floors you, you've just sailed into your sentence categorically stating that the government wants to do this or this, and then you get the wretched nicht at the end. Well, it happens, and there are ways around it. And then all the big panic of the students is, what if you miss something? Well, if you miss something, you have ways around missing something. Most of the time, it doesn't matter. People say everything lots of times. If you miss something, it's probably because the speaker's going very, very fast and reading, which we hate, but that's what speakers do. You learn to deal with all these key words. These are the things that crop up in Roderick Jones's book, which is a brilliant book, and Roderick has also given me lots of tips for this talk today, as has Dick. If you get Roderick Jones and Dick Fleming on your side, you're pretty well away, I assure you. These are the two big names in interpreter training. Right, here we go back to this wretched split attention. What can you do about it? Shadowing. Shadowing is the best way. Just keep having them listen to people, listen to the radio even, and just say the same thing in the same language in a different way. Shadowing is probably the best way around. It also means that it's a chance to practice using different words. Reformulate, in other words. How can you avoid them sticking to the words and syntax? Yes, the source language. They do. Beginners do. You get horrible, sentences which don't make sense at all. A lot of this is practice, and I always tell every student, record yourself from the day one. Keep recording yourself and then listen, by the way. I'm sure they all record for hours and then forget in the evening. Listen to yourself. You will immediately see what you're doing. And in some cases, you can find remedies for this as well. So those are a couple of issues and ways round. This is Roderick's point he made to me too. He said, look, there are two problems. One is the acoustic thing of listening, which is listening and talking, which is not a problem, like the piano playing. And he said, it's like consecutive. You're doing lots of things there too. You're also taking notes, listening, working out what the speaker's saying, reformulating it, communicating it back. There's a hell of a lot of things involved in consecutive. So one shouldn't be daunted by these things which keep cropping up. The greater problem, and he's absolutely right, is the intellectual one, because you don't know what's going to happen when you start. Now, here is a wonderful, I might have to fish out Roderick's paper for this, because I've done it as short as I can. Can't have PowerPoints with too many words, and there are too many words on this. Roderick says, you can do the micro level first. Take a sentence. You don't know where it's going. Gestern Abend kam ich in einen Unfall auf der Autobahn zwischen bla im Regen, and it goes on like that. Eine Familie, die von den Ferien, and it goes on. Now what's going to come at the end? Either or mit dem Leben davon. So what are you going to do with that? You're going to slice it up. There was an accident on the motorway. A family was travelling back from their holidays. Stop. The weather conditions were not good. Stop. And so on and so forth. Salami tactics. Until you know whether they did, poor people, survive or not, which you only find out right at the end. Then your final sentence will be, fortunately they all, they're all recovered, or they're all out of danger now, or something. But that is the sort of issue you get where you don't know what's going to happen. So you have to start, and you have to start slicing the sentence. And you, of course you can't do anything else with German except reformulate it. But that was this, I've just put dots to fill in the bits, but you get the picture. That's the sort of long sentence, whether you know German or not, that we do have to contend with. And then you've got the general thing. We don't know what the argument is going to be, especially now, economic crisis. There are so many possible things people will say. You know, you think, oh, it's recession, or it's inflation, or it's this or that. I don't know much about economics, but I've learned a lot through the years of being an interpreter. But you really do not know at the moment whether people think that the European Central Bank should reduce interest rates to stimulate the economy, or keep them high, because both options are open, and members of the EU governments have different views. So you're not necessarily going to be able to guess, which you could more easily in the past. So you've got, that's the macro level. It's difficult to contend with, but it's also true that with years of experience, and even months of experience, you begin to get the picture of how sentences will go and where people are going, from their body language, from their intonation. Now, we have fantastic working conditions in Brussels, and I suspect everyone would be very envious of them. We always get to see the whole meeting room, and we're not too high up either. Now, of course, you've always got speakers who you know, you can only see the back of their heads, because there are a lot of people in that room. But by watching, by listening, by paying attention to what's going on, you can get the picture fairly well. I'm sure that people knew approximately what Mrs. Merkel was going to say in the last few summits. Indeed, Mr. Sarkozy as well, and poor old Mr. Papandreou. You know, you aren't going to put your foot in it too badly if you know the issues a bit. Students, please read the newspapers, I keep saying. Mr. Papandreou, oh, I have one. And I'm saying, what? I can't believe this. I said something about, I made a speech, I mean, I'm always making speeches, about the oil crisis in 1973. 8 students in the room, nobody had heard of it. Don't you think that's amazing? They didn't even have a clue what I was talking about. Oil what? You know, was it olive oil I was referring to? I can't believe sometimes, I know. And then I get very, very impatient and say, look, I'm not teaching people who are not reading the papers. Go and find out. Oil. Go and Google it, you know. I know, I'm very impatient. Yeah, here we go, look at it. The intellectual problem. Thank you, Roderick. He agrees with me too. Be informed, read the papers, listen to what's going on in the meeting, apropos oil. This is not apocryphal. I remember it happening very well in a meeting where, oh, this is a long time ago, one of the very senior staff interpreters working into French, he was of Hungarian origins, but there was no Hungary in the EU then, he worked into French. He left the booth. Now, actually, this is a very UN-ish, don't quote me, I'm being recorded, tactic, used to be a tactic in the EU, in the UN, a way of working, half an hour on, half an hour off. And I worked in Geneva especially with freelance colleagues who did a lot of UN work. In the EU we don't do that, we work usually according to language, and we try to listen to the meeting even if we're not actually interpreting, because things might happen in that meeting, might be useful. In those days, in those grim, dim, dark ages of years ago, the UN interpreters, on the dot of 10:30, would say, you know, you're working with someone who would say, And now, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to give the floor to stop. Mr. So-and-so from the French delegation. You had to pick it up like that. Now, this is not kind of highly professional. And this particular story this is EU now, so listening all the time. The bloke concerned goes out of the booth and goes to have a cup of coffee. Well, fair enough, but he did it a bit once too often. He comes back into the booth. It was the ambassadors' meeting, EU ambassadors, and he sits down. He puts the headphone on, and the other colleague, who's getting impatient because it was probably 40 minutes, wanting him to take over, sort of pushes, and he puts the headphone on straight in and starts hearing something about oil, and he starts. Oui, en ce qui concerne donc le pétrole, and he goes on and on. Got it, it was olive oil. It was olive oil. Moral of the story, children, is you stay in the booth, at least most of the time. And if your colleague has been out for a while, you might be kind enough to brief quickly. This is on some olive oil. Okay, things of that sort. Yeah, anticipation. It's true that there are lots of things people say you just know, and they're halfway through. I remember listening to Bush often enough. You just knew what he was going to say. Tony Blair. Honest, straightforward way. Look, I think we should all be clear. You just knew what was coming next. We're going to have to make sacrifices. No. More taxes. Thank you very much. We know how stuff will be very often. Here's another good story about the Italian speaker. Italian speakers, lots of you have Italian, right? Yeah? Show hands, Italian? Yeah? Well, you know how Italian speakers are, I'm sure. A certain Mr. Berlusconi being a very good example of this. Mr. Berlusconi and most other Italian speakers, not Mario Monti, by the way, talk quite a lot and wrap everything in a nice way. Nel quadro generale in cui portiamo avanti i vari discorsi. Nothing you can say at all in English for that. And that can be done for a very long time, actually. Like sort of 15 minutes longer. And a colleague of mine was interpreting one of these very wordy, verbage Italian quadro generale type speeches. And he was going quite fast, the quadro generale as well, and the interpreter very laid back. We knew what was coming, he knew what was coming. Got to the end of his sentence, as he knew the speaker, he saw the speaker was coming to an end finally. The interpreter goes, races to the end, switches off, turns to his colleague and says, got there first. Finished before the speaker. Absolutely true. Good old Peter. I won't give you his surname now. But I mean, we do this, it happens. Students, of course, can't imagine that. Well, of course they can't, and they shouldn't, because they haven't been there. But finished before, yeah. No problem at all. I remember once having a bet with somebody. I shouldn't reveal all these things. It was a particularly tedious speaker in a tedious meeting, and we knew the tedium of the thing and what he would say. And I said, I'm going to not listen and carry on interpreting for 5 minutes and see if it makes any difference. I didn't. I didn't because he said to me, well, actually we both started to get the giggles at that stage. And when you have le fou rire in the booth, there is only one thing to do. Somebody has to get out fast. And I think it was Neil who left the booth very quickly, leaving me, and then I thought, I don't dare, okay. But I'm sure it wouldn't have mattered. Don't say these things to students. Who would faint, of course, if they have a prospect. But, when you've been doing this job a long time. Techniques for salami. Back to the salami again. Yeah, this is another one. Avoid starting sentences with things, subordinates like despite the fact that. The government aims to do this, blah, 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 comma, however. You cut the sentence, you never start with a despite. And I always say avoid the passive voice as well, because it's complicated in English and students always mess it up. Voice at this stage. People's voices, very important. I haven't actually got a slide on that, and that doesn't matter. Again, have people record themselves and listen. You know that kind of voice that goes up at the end of the sentence? And I was going down the road, and then the speaker said so-and-so, so-and-so, and you don't know if it's a question or not, because this is youth speak now. Voice goes up at end of sentence. No, it doesn't if you're an interpreter, otherwise the entire world thinks you're asking questions instead of actually saying things. Your manner, how you speak, these are very important things. They usually come at the end of a training course, but they should always be present. Avoid people and it's awful in the booth. Things like sighing, students do it. The other day I was listening to students who just started simultaneous, and it was a mock conference. It was much too early to put them into a mock conference, but that's what they did there. There were all sorts of and then another one was, oh my God. I said, no, you can't do this, you can't do this. You keep your thoughts to yourself if you don't mind. Learn to discipline yourself. Gasps and wails, oh dear me no. Not good habits to get into. So how can we teach these poor, unfortunate, miserable students of interpreting how to do all these things? What's the method? Well, you do the same as you did with consecutive, same language speeches. They're all together, frantic about headset on one ear only ever, so they can at least hear their own voices. They clamp the headphones to their heads and then sit like this, you know, sit up straight, breathe properly, one headset on. Then very gently introduce them. You've done the speech already last week on the economic crisis. We're now going to do it again, the same speech, but in simultaneous. So no sort of surprise elements. Indeed, English, Spanish, French, Italian, fine. It's a technique we're teaching. Keep it simple until the technique is mastered. And then gradually you're going to get longer and more difficult, and we're going to have a variety of topics, but we do this step by step. And I really get annoyed with teachers who seem to think that, you know, they've got to get there tomorrow. They all have at least a year of training, an academic year. I know that's not that long. But if you overload your students at the beginning, they will not make it. They get put off and they get into bad habits. So everything should be simple, each stage. Fairy tales, your once upon a time stories. Little anecdotal things. You know, last week I was in Prague and I took the train from Prague to Olomouc, and it's a lovely little town. This sort of thing. There's no need for it to be difficult. The difficulty will come later. And then you just do this on a very, very gradual basis. And then we have one big golden rule that I've just written down here on my page. Finish the sentence. You can threaten them with anything you like if they don't finish sentences, and they don't at the beginning. Students in the booth get panic-stricken, can't follow, can't do it, and then I will say, I don't care what you do, finish the sentence some way or another, and never let them get away with unfinished sentences. How? Thank you, Mr. Murray, for giving me some nice pictures. Reformulation. Yes. Recording is very important, and then you play back if possible with the original, which we can do easily with most equipment that we have. Listen to where the students have said literal things and sound peculiar, and then get the whole group saying, how could we all find other things together here? I always have people working in groups if possible. Anybody else any suggestions? So they don't feel picked on, you know, they don't feel you're focusing on the mistakes they made. We all make mistakes. Somebody said to me, another trainer, Nick Roach, said to me, you know what, it's very important that people make mistakes. If they don't, we've nothing to work on. And they all think, as we're all brought up to think, that we must always do everything perfectly right from the start. Well, not teaching people how to interpret. If they don't make mistakes, nobody goes anywhere. So this is something I think you bang into them as well. You should make mistakes. We'll all learn together. So somebody says something peculiar and it sounds very literal. Fine, they will. How can we all find other ways of saying it? Let's have everybody pitch in with 3 different expressions that would, or synonyms that would work here. Don't follow the same sentence structure. I said the despite thing and the gestern Abend in einem Unfall and so forth. Just say, this is the exercise for now. For the next half an hour, you guys, we're going to start every sentence we hear in a very different way from the speakers. Doesn't matter if it goes wrong. Just the idea of forcing yourself, rather than, you know, je suis sur le, I am on the, take a bit of a distance. and all these isations that we don't like too much in English as well. This reminds me of the Arthur Scargill, British trade unionist. At the time, just the time of Thatcher and the miners' strike and all that, there was lots of isations. They loved to have long words, those trade unionists. Procrastination, pronounced like that. Arbitration. And I always thought, what is this Asian thing that they like to have here all the time? Actually, English prefers, let's arbitrate, let's reformulate, using the verb rather than the noun. But do you want me to shut up for a minute, by the way? Okay. No, I just thought, if I'm going on and you want a break, just say so. I'll try and vary this and go on to different things as well. So, turning nouns into verbs and avoiding sounding like Arthur Scargill. Procrastination, he loved that. Well, a man with shredded wheat on his head, what can you expect? You would, of course. You probably don't know what he looks like, most of you, but Google him, Arthur Scargill. More salami tactics, yes, of course. Every time in simultaneous, that will come back time and time and time again. Cut it up. Verbal diarrhea, that's a nice one, that. Have you ever listened, you probably have, to not so good interpreting? It's one of the features of the not very good interpreter, is again, like the student at the beginning, not ever to shut up. Non-stop, all day. It is frightful. It is horrible. And it sounds just killing. You just want to take your headset off and kill yourself. So how do we do that? What do we do with that? We make them take a distance from the speaker is one thing. Just wait for a bit. I know, people are so panic-stricken they'll miss something. It's fine. Have a distance. Then do the same speech with the student. Do it twice. Do it 3 times. Each time they will feel more confident about hanging back because they know what's coming, and they will realize that they haven't missed anything, they can reword it, they can reformulate it, and no harm came of a few pauses. And if you give a speech, you read out a speech with no pauses in the manner that I was demonstrating, they will see pretty quickly how horrible that sounds. And I have heard senior interpreters speak like that. It is really the most revolting thing ever to have to listen to. If ever you're listening to an interpreter who can't shut up, know that it is probably not a good one. It's usually the sign of weakness. Sorry, but that is true. Demo of wordiness, and I put a pause sign. Just shut up. Other things they do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving this draw. I would now like to comment on what we've got different. Yeah, it's okay at the beginning. If it goes on for too long, you begin to worry about it. But it usually means, again, they're not listening properly. They're too tense. It's nearly always this. The headset is not on properly as well. Again, one ear only. Going from Spanish into Finnish, for example, it's true that it is much harder than, say, Italian into Spanish, although the les faux amis and the temptation to stick to the structure from 2 Latin languages, with 2 Latin languages, is also great. It's another problem. I've seen this so many times, that sort of thing. Slow down. We'll slow the speech down. We will go more slowly. We'll breathe deeply. Sit up straight. Take it easy. This is usually nerves, nearly always. That's what I've seen. And once they begin to get the hang of it and realize you can flow when you speak, it works. These are not things that happen overnight. And breathing is very important as well. We usually give them a few courses, how to breathe from the diaphragm, and none of this sitting all sloppily about the booth as well, sitting up straight. But it's very irritating to listen to if they're just learning that jerky delivery. Etiquette. How to behave in the booth. Well, it's a funny thing, but in the school which I was at recently too, where they had one-person booths, I don't like this. Have a space for 2 if you possibly can. Because they get into the habit of being alone, and even if it's a large enough booth for 2 or 3, if the students are always alone in there, they find it terribly upsetting when suddenly one day they find themselves sitting next to another person who's come barging into their territory. Really, there's something to get them used to pretty early on, and then how to work with another person. That all sounds very obvious to you perhaps, but it isn't. How to sit, how not have all your papers spilling over into the other person's area. You know, there's this sphere stuff as well. And don't wear too heavy perfumes and all sorts of things like that. How to hand over. They make the most frightful pigs here all the time at the beginning of one person stopping and the next one taking over. There's a whole lot of crashing and banging going on, or else, you know, there's the old ex-UN system of, and Mr. Chairman, I would now like to, next person takes over. We don't do it like that. You have to explain the gestures we give each other when we hand over. And I'd like to say to the German delegate that, frankly, we really don't agree with what he's proposed, but we will give it the most careful consideration. And then your person takes over. But there's a lot of this gestury stuff they don't know about. And then suddenly you get stuck, or you get the fit of the giggles, or something happens to you. They have to take over very quickly, too. Or the speaker suddenly says, I'd like to give you a few figures. Figures, we all hate numbers. Pen, quickly, pen. 8,763,459. Then these terrible numbers now with all these billions and trillions and God knows what. Awful. Help each other, we say. Write it down for the other colleague. Write it down legibly. I can't think of the number of times in my career where, and I'm really bad on numbers, where I've been going, hey, waiting for someone to help me, and they write it down, you can't read it, so you're going, and they think, or somebody's name. They don't articulate names or numbers, so you get, you know, I don't know, a name that is not very familiar to you, a Lithuanian name. Grabouskaite, for example. That's easy. That's one I can think of. Write it in big letters. It's not all squidged up, and you're going whatever. These are all little techniques which actually are extremely important in teamwork in the booth, and which, of course, the students don't know. The teacher should sit with the student in the booth regularly, so they see how the student is behaving, how they're sitting. They're not slouching, and no sighing, as I said. Oh, the other one is laughter into the mic. So you tell you say something mildly amusing, and the interpreter goes, and it's really, really annoying. Whoever's listening has not got the joke, so they feel excluded, they haven't got the joke. And this interpreter's in the joke and they're not. You know, there's all kind of resentment building up there. And then, of course, also the interpreter has a laugh which is naturally going to be louder over the mic. So you've got this sudden burst of laughter. I always say to them, I don't care how funny anything is, you just lose your sense of humour. You say it and you let them decide if it's worth laughing at. They are the customer, not you. Which is the big thing you have to get into their minds. You know, life is not there for the interpreter. Sorry, students, no, actually. All good, you know. No. We are there to serve a purpose, to provide a service. It's a thing they only get at the very end about providing a service. So that's booth etiquette. Yes, listen critically. They have difficulties sometimes in listening critically to each other. Again, this is positive, helpful, and useful. If you listen to your colleague who is saying quite a lot of the time, you might point out the ums are beginning to be too numerous. And it's irritating and it's distracting from the message you're passing over. So you can tell your colleague, who will be massively offended and will probably offend you back. Now, we're going on to the next stage. Breathe again. We're going on to, yes, I'm sorry he's not with us anymore, I know, but it was the best illustration I could find. Simultaneous interpreting. We've looked at possible ways of salami, of shadowing, of short sentences, of reformulating sentences, of how to sit in the booth, how to, the distance from the mic. Now, of course, a lot of the time, it's not only multitasking we're doing, we're actually also having to do sight translation a lot in the booth simultaneously. It's horrible. It's the thing I hated most. And it's the thing which is most common now. In the United Nations, as I very well know, they read speeches a lot of the time. In the European Parliament, assemblies especially, the plenaries, they read speeches. Ministerial meetings used to be ministers chatting to each other. Now what do? They read speeches. So you have to bear in mind there are ways of approaching simultaneous with a text, commonly known as advanced multitasking by my friend Kate Davis, who gave me some tips on this one. Now you get the first instance, you get your speech a week, a day, a couple of days before. That's the ideal, of course. You might get it just before, and then you don't get it at all, or at the very last minute. By the way, that last picture of the late departed Mr. Gaddafi, Colonel Gaddafi, he was at the UN, I think it was 2 years ago, was it, or a year? It's quite recent, the last time, in fact, where he took his own interpreter, and he talked for 70-something minutes. Gaddafi's excuse had been he would speak a dialect that only his interpreter knew. And he didn't. So it was all right in the end. Now we get the option of preparation. You've got time to prepare. Research the subject. A glossary is a useful thing to prepare beforehand if you have the time. You note ideas, names, numbers, acronyms. Ugh. The horror of our day, acronym after acronym. Everybody, wherever you go, has a set of about 20 acronyms that they assume you know. Everybody does this. I'm sure that you do, I do, we all do. YAMLAT, UCG. How are you supposed to know what that is? Some of you do, of course. You annotate your text, but it shouldn't end up looking like a complete mess. Mark out main points and arguments. If you know who you're going to be working with, you can then also split it up. So if I'm going to do, whatever, this is Merkel first, then you can do Sarkozy next, and ainsi de suite. You can do it that way if you have the time, but, isn't he looks very proud of himself. Sarkozy, that is, by the way, in case anyone is not recognizing it. Be careful, because speakers will depart from the text. They do. And that's really, I must say, I really do not like sight translation. But as I said, this is what people are having to contend with now. And you just have to get on with it. Keep glancing at the text and drop it if need be. This is the other thing that students don't like to. You have to sometimes, if you're going to not find yourself half an hour behind the speaker. This is the most common thing I remember. Shortly beforehand, you get your text. Whizzing through the German text with a yellow highlighter looking for the verbs. Quickly going through the verbs, idioms, numbers and names again. And then, of course, you've got your colleague next to you. So you start doing the German text. They're there to help you as well, you hope. And whilst I'm doing the German speech pretty sort of without much preparation, at least my colleague Dick is getting a bit of time to prepare the next one. So he's got an advantage. And if it goes on like that all day, you end up being pretty well in the same position. But some good work about how to teach interpreting. Look at Roderick Jones's book, published by St. Jerome, Mona Baker, Manchester University. So that should be quite easy to find. Dick, I don't know that he's published anything, but he is the most brilliant interpreter with Andrew Brooks that I have ever heard in my 38 years of career. Those are my two stars. And Dick is most assuredly one of the best teachers in general and interpreter trainers anywhere in the world. For my money, he is the absolute best. Now, I hope their ears are buzzing, or whatever it is your ears are supposed to do when people are talking about you. This is my final one. Nice, isn't it, with all those stars? I should have had the last one saying Happy Christmas, I realised. Here are the mechanisms that I've mentioned about introducing simultaneous, along with all the rest. I mentioned anticipation, recul, décalage, in other words, salami tactics, multitasking, reformulation, simultaneous with the text, how to deal with it. But if anybody else has any bright ideas, this is not the absolute truth, and I'm quite sure there are lots and lots of other points I could make. And there may be other ideas you have as well. And maybe some of your experience might be interesting to hear. I don't know how many of you have worked in simultaneous, have worked with younger colleagues, have done any teaching, what your field is that might or might not be relevant to any of this, but it's always nice to share experience. So I think that really is, I think you're absolutely brilliant to have stayed awake. How do you have for so long? They always say, as I said, 20 minutes is the most, and 40 is the typical university lecture, isn't it? 40 minutes. And then they switch off, everybody switches off. And the United Nations in former times, interpreters, 30 minutes on and off. But they don't do it anymore. So thank you all very much for looking and sounding interested, whether you were or not. Yes?
One thing that you said that interested me a lot, because it's...
I'll repeat the question for those at the back, don't worry. Yeah?
It was counterintuitive to me. You said that it's not a requirement to be bilingual and that you yourself are not bilingual, and I don't understand that.
Bilingualism. The question is, I said it's not necessary to be bilingual. Now, I said that because it isn't necessary to be bilingual. Absolutely not. In the field of conference interpreting, which is what I'm in. When I started in 1973 with the European Commission, with my colleagues, there was one single golden rule: speak your mother tongue correctly, in the right register, with a good vocabulary. And forget even trying to speak any other language. Your other languages are your C languages. Only comprehension is needed. This is Ivory Tower, European Union, and Ivory Tower, United Nations. I am fully aware that to be bilingual is a great advantage, and in the case of public service interpreting, probably a necessity. Or as near as, damn it, bilingual, I mean B language, strong B. For the purposes of the European Union and the United Nations, we always only interpret into our mother tongue, with all the exceptions that I mentioned before. The Latvians, because nobody English-speaking knows Latvian, or Estonian, or Lithuanian, or Maltese, and so on and so forth. The same applies to the Chinese and Arabic booths in the United Nations. They all have to work into English or French usually, from Chinese and from Arabic. Those are the exemptions, if you like. But in my case, I'm anything but a bilingual. Roderick Jones is a bilingual, French, by the way. He works into English and into French from those languages, and German and Italian and Czech and Slovak. But he's a clever boy, is Roderick. Told you got a first from Oxford. So being a bilingual is not a disadvantage in any way. On the contrary, it's a great advantage. It just has never been, and I think never will be, a requirement for a conference interpreter for the international organizations. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Thank you. Any others? Yes?
I'm wondering if you can impart to us any words of wisdom about simultaneous whispered interpretation.
Whispered interpretation. Words of wisdom from me. I wish I had lots of words of wisdom. But for whispering, we didn't actually ever learn it on the 4-month course that I did. I was just shoved into a room one day and told to whisper into somebody's ear, and which I did. And it wasn't somebody, it was 4 people, and it became shouting rather than whispering. There's nothing worse than whispering going on around a ministerial lunch table where the whispering is, each one is getting louder than the other one in order to drown out the other one. Those are words of wisdom as to how, if possible, you can avoid doing things like that, i.e. keep the number of listeners to 2 with the interpreter between the 2. I simply applied the normal techniques that I would use in the booth for simultaneous, for whispering. And in most of my experience, and I do mean ministerial lunches and dinners were the main examples, I would whisper to a couple of, I had one day I had to, oh yeah, I remember what happened to me. It was a huge informal ministerial meeting in France. And it was a vast, great dinner afterwards. And the Italian delegate, and I do not, as I just pointed out, I do not work into other languages. But you do what you have to do. I found myself sitting next to an Italian minister, and the rest of the room basically understood English, except him, but they'd forgotten to send the Italian interpreter. So I found myself whispering into Italian, my 3rd language, to the minister, and then doing consecutive from French into English for the rest of the room. Except that even I am not an absolute total multitasker to the 99th degree. And of course I kept finding myself whispering into English to the poor Italian delegate. Ma signora, per favore, io non capisco. Ah, sorry. And that was whispered, because at least it was only one customer, even if I got the language wrong sometimes. But the rest of the room I was, note-taking away and shouting away to everybody. And on the subject of that, by the way, one short anecdote about the actor and the interpreter, if I may. At another similar dinner given by a French minister, informal councils are done in the country of the presidency of the EU, and they are basically intended to show off your country and your cuisine, especially if you're French. So we go to the constituency of this minister, who organised a huge dinner. All the ministers were present, and most of them with their wives, or in rare cases, husbands. So it was a very large number of people. And I went to the minister, because I'm quite used to going and tapping on shoulders of ministers, I had half of my life doing that. And I said, Monsieur le ministre, est-ce que vous avez l'intention de faire un discours à la fin de ce dîner? Mais non, madame, certainement pas, je veux que tout le monde soit relax, mais on va manger très bien, vous allez voir. Et le vin est excellent, mais non, vous en faites. Vous pouvez boire, vous pouvez manger ce que vous voulez, je ne veux pas faire de discours. Vous êtes sûr, monsieur le ministre? Absolument certain, of course. Never believe a politician. Don't. Something told me that a politician in his own constituency can't help getting on his feet to make a speech. Especially French. Anybody, actually. So, when you get towards the end of the meal, I'd had one glass of wine. I can cope with that fine. And I had my notebook beside me. Never go anywhere without your notebook. And then, what did he do? Rather red in the face, he got up to speak after the meal. Now, he is the owner of vineyards. Very impressive vineyards, and he had quaffed quite a lot of the contents of said vineyards himself during the course of this excellent and long meal. So he first of all starts me, Monsieur, chers amis, long speech, and I'm taking notes, blah, 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 and I get up. I like doing this actually, I have no problem with that. I get up, and he'd forgotten totally I was there, so I had to stop him after about 10 minutes. 10 minutes, kids, I say to those who say note-taking should only be for 3 or 4. Monsieur le ministre, qu'est-ce que je pourrais, s'il vous plaît? Ah oui, bien sûr, pardon. L'interprète a la parole. So l'interprète has the parole and gives the speech, condensing as much as I could, not to bore everyone into a pace. Whereupon I think, oh, thank God, that's over. No. Maintenant, je voudrais vous présenter le chef qui a préparé ce repas. The chef is going to come and speak now. So this very sweaty, greasy, brilliant, famous chef in France is hoiked, poor man, kicking and screaming out of the kitchen into the room. Vous allez raconter à tout le monde comment vous avez préparé ce dîner. So he does tell us how he prepared every single one of those courses. And this meant a lot of marination. Perhaps marinating we like better in English, don't we? We don't have marinations here. Marinating of the cheek of the fish in a marinade. Oh God, I can't remember. Anyway, it's a long time ago. So I wrote it all down. I'm not bad at I was writing it all down. And went on a good 15 minutes this. No, yeah, 15 minutes, and a lot of people had a lot of wine as well. They're not always absolutely happy to listen to some wretched interpreter getting up and interrupting the proceedings, especially those who knew French, like the unpleasant British minister. Anyway, long time ago, John Major government. So I get up and off I go. Ladies and gentlemen, and I really did condense it. I would like to say a few words about how I prepared this meal. I'm the chef, right? And this was marinated in that, and this was simmered in this, and there was so-and-so added, and a touch of this and a pinch of that, and on I go, and marjoram, and I don't know what, all this. I mean, I knew the words, it wasn't a problem. And if I didn't, I left it out. And who was going to know the difference at that stage? Probably ruined the rest of me, actually, by missing out on something else, really. Can't boil an egg. Just to say that this is also the acting role of the interpreter. You can become anything. You can become whatever it is you have to become, including a great chef. Now, if I remembered correctly everything he'd written, who knows, I might have become a great chef. At least I put myself into that. It was just another anecdote. There are hundreds of them. But I won't go into any more. Any more questions? It was a bit like this. It was with tables all over the place, littered with bottles and marinations and what have you. Marinade, yes, I know. More? No? Yes?
Have you ever encountered like hostility to more or less accent? I French interpreter. Like once I was in a situation where they sent my colleague home.
Because
at the
no, what was the reason?
First phone, well, there weren't not many people needed interpretation. There was people Québécois. My colleague had a very correct, what I would call alliance française.
I absolutely get you. This is okay.
I don't know if it was necessarily language, it was attitude or we were just talking about this yesterday about Croatian and Serbian interpreters, where where it gets very difficult, and it's always taken. It can be taken as a sort of, an attack. Oh, you've given me a Croatian interpreter, and actually it should be a Serbian interpreter, or is it Serbian? Yeah, I know. So the Québécois and the Alliance Française story is the same sort of thing. It has never happened to me personally, and I can think of only one example, and there's not much you can do about this. If somebody has a particular sensitivity, well, they have a particular sensitivity. But if they say, oh, I don't want that interpreter has to go, I would say, well, I'm very sorry, you're having that interpreter, and you're just going to like it. Unless the interpreter makes a mistake and does something wrong, which is not the case here at all we're talking about, they're going to have to put up with it. If you know in advance there are political sensitivities, you try and take account of them, of course. The thing I'm thinking of was an Italian colleague of mine, Piero Bononcini, who is from Bologna. And the Bolognese have a very distinct way of speaking. And the rest of the Italians like the Bolognese. It's rare in Italy. They all hate each other's guts, but not the Bolognese. Everyone loves them. Cuisine, good living, Emilia-Romagna, good wine, good food. It's true. They always like the Bolognese. But it's a very, very definite way of speaking. And Piero made no attempt to sound anything other than Bolognese when he interpreted. He was clear, but you could hear very clearly where he came from. Except one day, one of the delegates was obviously from Bologna and thought that Piero was taking the mick out of him, and came round the back and said, excuse me, must say. And then, of course, he heard Piero speak, and Piero said, ma io sono di Bologna, io sono bolognese, come lei. Ah, va bene, tutto bene. And they love each other for life. But that's the only example in 38 years I can ever remember of anything like that happening. There were a few political sort of comments at the very beginning of when Portugal joined the EU. We didn't have enough Portuguese interpreters, and we had Brazilian interpreters. It wasn't that they disliked the Brazilian. The argument was, jobs for our boys, please. We want our Portuguese student interpreters to be given the work, not Brazilians. It was more for that reason. And it all faded very easily, because actually the two Brazilians concerned left after a while anyway, and there was no problem about it once we trained up enough Portuguese interpreters to take over. But I suppose it could happen, yes. I mean, these things do happen. You just deal with them as diplomatically as possible. Yes?
I was wondering if, I was taught that you have to be one sentence behind the speaker. If that's still the case in simultaneous?
One sentence behind the speaker.
Or do you think that it depends on the language?
It depends on the language. For consecutive, you went to consec.
Simultaneous.
But were you referring the first time to consecutive? No, you just mentioned simultaneous, right? Because I was going to say sentence by sentence, consecutive I know is exists and is used a lot. We never use it. When I said 15-minute speeches, that's what we do, but normally 5 or 6 minutes. In the booth, a sentence behind, you open your mouth when you've understood. Now, if that's 3 sentences, it's 3 sentences. And you learn all sorts of tricks of the trade, mostly experience. That's the only thing I can really recommend, how to catch up afterwards. If you've missed a few things, like the family, that long German sentence, you can come back afterwards and just slot it back in. I wouldn't be so specific as that. Behind the speaker, of course, unless you're the famous Italian verbiage one where the interpreter finished before the speaker, but that's a bit of a special exception. Yes?
Have you ever encountered a situation where you can't understand the speaker very well? Either they have a lisp or their pronunciation, or they're trying to speak in not their own native language? What do you do in those?
I have had lots and lots. The answer to the question was, have I had experience of not understanding somebody who perhaps just wasn't clear or had a lisp? But very nice man too, but he really, really had trouble with English, and he couldn't speak Japanese, he wasn't allowed to, so he spoke English at a technical conference. I think it was on nuclear physics. Yeah, I don't know much about it, but I can pretend I do. And I studied the documents, and he started to speak, and no one realized that it was English for quite a while, actually. And then there was the usual fumbling of the headsets in the room, and the general, we're in a row. It was in Stresa, in Italy. I can see the scene to this day. We're all sitting in a row in these booths going, what language is it? And then the English booth, me and my colleague, realized that it was indeed, we had the paper, or we hoped that he would stick to the paper, because there's not much else to go on. You normally do have documents. And so we interpreted into English from the very difficult Japanese English, and the French booth took relay from us. And so did the Italian and the Germans. They took relay from the English booth. That's what we did. That was the most extreme example of difficult speakers. But yes, these things happen. You know, and everybody was happy. Nobody noticed anything. The show must go on. It's another one. Somebody said to me, what happens if you really don't know a key word? There was a press conference. Press conferences are given by commissioners, members of the commission, often the president of the commission, on a regular weekly basis. This was an emergency press conference on fisheries. This is a subject dear to this country too, fisheries. Whoever was fishing in the wrong waters, I forget who at the time, there's always somebody fishing in the wrong waters. Norwegians are fishing in the Estonian waters, or the Canadians are fishing in the Norwegian waters, but something of that sort. A major Cold War was about to break out again. And it was the Greenland halibut. I wouldn't recognise it if I met it, but it was the Greenland halibut anyway that was at stake. This fish was being fished wrongly or illegally by whichever country. The commissioner was Emma Bonino, an excellent, very, very good, decent Italian politician. There's somebody you'd like to see her at the helm. But anyway, she was the commissioner for fisheries at the time. So we had an emergency fisheries press conference convened with Emma Bonino going to speak about this fish. And a friend of mine, colleague of mine, was called into the English booth at the very last minute. You're on standby, he was getting there. Now, in the DG interpretation, we have a fisheries glossary, which is everybody's Bible. You don't move without it. The glossary is, as you can imagine, full of obscure and really unusual sounding types of fish, categories of fish. This particular colleague, Ian, forgot or didn't have time to pick up the glossary, races into the press conference room, into the booth, sits down. Emma Bonino starts to tell the world's press, and usually CNN and BBC is often is recording us directly, so it was nice to know. And off she goes. What's happening? And Ian couldn't remember the name of the fish. She's speaking Italian, right? Emma Bonino's Italian. He couldn't remember what it was called. He went right through the whole press conference with great aplomb, he's a brilliant interpreter, and he talked about this fish, and you'll know exactly what this is about. This is a major drama because this fish is really going to be overfished by the Norwegians, whoever it was. And anybody noticed that he never said the fish? Everybody else knew. Everybody else knew in the room, all the press knew that it was the Greenland and whatnot, and so did everybody, so they just assumed they'd heard it. I'm afraid that's absolutely true. None of these stories are invented. They are all things that I've either witnessed or I've seen the said colleagues saying, I was going to die, I didn't know the name. But it didn't matter at all. It's what I say to students when they say, what do you do if you don't know the word? It doesn't matter. It's never about the word, I say. They're always true. Back to the marry Niles in a minute. Any more questions? You've surely had enough of me. Oh, good. One more, yes?
So I'm just wondering, how would you deal with the situation if you really get stuck with a certain word or terminology, but you have to interpret it? And how do you do it?
Well, you do like Ian did. You just you give the word in the original language, and if you're dealing with a group of experts, they usually know the terms that you don't know. It's the bit around they want. Are you in favour of it or not, or do you want 50 milligrams of it or 20? I think this is something you should instill in student interpreters from the very beginning. The first thing is, of course, is that anything you ever hear in any meeting is secret, is never to be divulged. The problem doesn't usually arise because, as I have pointed out to student interpreters many a time, most interpreters forget what they've just heard anyway, pretty quickly. You know what I'm talking about, don't you? I come out of the booth and I've been slaving away with fish, whatever it was, for the whole day, and someone says, "Oh, hi, what were you in today?" Hang on, I can't remember. Because you forget. Thank God, we'd all be even madder than we already are if we had to sort of absorb and hang on to all this information. So that would be one thing, that you never repeat anything you've heard. Now, if you actually want to listen and focus so that you will remember for your own interest, then you will probably make that effort. But I remember the only one case where I've ever heard of a problem, and it was because the interpreter concerned was married to a journalist. What did you do at the office today, dear? I was with the Ministers of Finance. And, says the journalist who's dying to know what happened, that's about, in fact, they didn't have a great problem because they decided they were never going to talk shop at home. So that put an end to that. Certainly, that's one very important thing, that you never reveal anything you've heard. You have to know how to behave, as I've always told interpreters too. When you go into a room, imagine a room like this, which is full of ministers, and the minister calls you over, or you have to jump between Mr. Sarkozy and Mr. Cameron. You have to know how to do this in a particular way. You don't get under people's feet. You don't clock off at lunchtime either, as I've told them. Never mind working hours. When you're in certain circumstances, it is essential you're there at all time. This means that you don't drink too much, so you don't have to go to the loo every 5 minutes. But you need to have stamina about you as well. This is not exactly a code of ethics, but these are all things which are important. Dress code, very important indeed. I remember my first boss, the most famous and illustrious, René van Hof-Haverkamp, who started our service, first Director General, female Director General ever in the Commission. She made an absolute rule, hard and fast rule, that all men wore ties and jackets at all times in all meetings, whatever the meeting would be. And in those days, women were not allowed to wear trousers, can you imagine? No trousers, this was in the 70s. Later on, we were allowed to wear trousers, but if she walked around the building to inspect the troops occasionally, and she came across anything less than well turned out, I don't mean Giorgio Armani, just decent turned out, there was always a big fuss. So how we dress, how we behave, how we address people, we do have to learn quite a lot about diplomacy as well. How to address a minister, an ambassador, the Archbishop of Canterbury, or whoever it might be, the Pope indeed. Well, we all know how to do that. But you need a lot of rules and regulations that you find out for yourself, or you go and look them up in the various guides that you have. How to address this or that, where to place yourself. I remember an interpreter saying to me, yes, but it's the ethics of the thing. I can't barge into the room and go across the room and stand by the speaker. Oh, yes, you can if you're the interpreter. If you can't hear, you can't interpret. But you don't elbow your way. You politely but firmly, with your notebook in hand, say, excuse me, I need to be beside the speaker if you wish to have an interpretation. They'll get the message very quickly. I've had to fight battles on working conditions as well. I remember being asked to work in booths. This is when I was with the European Commission, and that is a big employer behind me, who I knew would back me, by the way. The booths were facing a brick wall, and the speakers were somewhere else. Now, this was before the days of teleconferencing and with screens that we now also can use in certain circumstances. And I said, no, we're not working in these circumstances. Of course, frightful, fast, dreadful woman I was. you know, wretched, bloody interpreters, all they do is mess things up for you, and so on and so forth. But then I had to stick to my guns and say, we cannot work if we can't see the speakers. We will do it in consecutive. There you are, that's another example. If the booths are no good, the interpreters are all trained, we will come out and we will do your meeting in consecutive mode, which is not popular because it meant the meeting would go on for a very long time. They found a solution, they imported different booths and they set them up within 2 hours and everybody was happy. But that's where I was in charge of the British presidency, all the meetings of the British presidency in 1992 in the UK. And I was doing this sort of thing all the time, arguing the toss. We had the final heads of state and government in Holyrood House in Edinburgh. Holyrood House is a beautiful, wonderful place. There was no room to put all the booths in. I forget how many we were then. So an architect was brought in to build 2 layers of booths, one on top of the other, with beautiful carved wood facades so that they blended into the room. You're going to laugh when I tell you they'd forgotten. Once you climbed up, they sort of pulled the steps away, so the interpreters on the top. Interpreters on the top. Theoretically, at least obliged to stay there for the rest of the day without any means of escape. But that was rectified afterwards. But again, that was with lots of planning, and it was a great deal of delicate negotiation between the British government, the Scottish office, the Holyrood House, how we would combine the needs, the requirements of the interpreters with the realities around. Interpreters sometimes, when they're new to, feel that they can throw their weight about more than they should. Put your foot down firmly and gently and politely is one thing. But I'm not doing this because so-and-so, or the booth's not hot enough or too cold, or any of those things, no. And I'm coming back to the beginning again of what I said. Golden rule is, I think the most important thing is never repeat anything you've ever heard. I have just done so today. I've just told you about the French minister. I've already broken the rule several times by telling you these anecdotes and the fisheries story, but I think by way of anecdote. Is there anything else that you would particularly like to know about in the field of ethics?
Well, no, I just wanted your general opinion about it, how you train.
Yes, this lady would like to ask something on the same, I think.
In the community interpreting, we're not allowed to have side conversations with service providers or clients. But in your field, does it happen that you have to have like polite conversation with ministers or
polite conversations? Yes. Thank you for mentioning that too. I love starting this, telling this story, because I start the story by saying, back in Edinburgh, here we are in 1992 or whatever it was again, I spent the night with Jean-Claude Juncker. No reactions? And Philip Maystadt. These were, Juncker is still the chair of the Eurogroup and the Prime Minister of Luxembourg. And he varies between Prime Minister, Minister of Economics and Finance. The man has been around forever, and he is a very good chap too. Philip Maystadt was then the Belgian Minister for Finance. The finance ministers were called upon to wait for the heads of state and government in the main room with the 2 layers, with the steps by now, so that if there was a meeting required that they would need to discuss particular issues on, they would be ready to do so. So the finance ministers and myself had nothing to do whilst we waited for the plenary, and it went on most of the night, as they always do. So we sat in an adjoining room, and it was the time in the EU when they were deciding on who would get the headquarters for what. Let me explain. There are lots of agencies in the EU. There was the European Central Bank, and everybody wanted to be host to that particular institution. So Maystadt and Juncker and myself were closeted in a room, just a room, drinking coffee and tea most of the night, chatting. So we played games of who would get which institution. So we had me dishing them out, saying, right, you can have the bank, and the other one saying, no, I want the Patents Institute, or agency as it's called. And then there was the evaluation of medicines one. All these things were being decided in the main room by the heads of state. And I spent the night discussing all this and having fun and games with Jean-Claude Juncker and Philip Maystadt. There you are. I had to spend a lot of time chatting to ministers, a lot, and around the dinner table. And sitting in a car with 2 Irish ministers going to a nightclub. Come on, Helen, do you ever join us? No, I can't possibly, ministers. I'm not going to a nightclub with you. Oh, come on, on now for the crack. We're taking the official car and the outriders. This is Rome. Rome, many years ago. Outriders. Have you ever seen police escorts, Italian cops on bikes? They're brilliant. They are brilliant. It's like a ballet. So that persuaded me to go with Sean and Fergus, who are still friends, can you believe, all these years later. Me squashed in the back of the car, the official car with flags and whatnot's going up the wrong way up the Via Veneto at about midnight. The wrong way up with the police outriders. I mean, you couldn't miss an opportunity like that, could you? It was terrific. And we went to the nightclub, and they said I had to go with them because somebody had to translate 2 vodka and cokes and 3 beers or whatever. And then I hung out with them quite a lot of the times while we went shopping with them and all the rest of it. Lots and lots and lots of times. Half of my carnet d'adresse, I'm kidding. It's not. Yes, sorry, somebody else wanted to.
Well, just a more quick comment. First of all, I guess as the English would say, your presentation was brilliant. I enjoyed it immensely. And have you ever done any court interpreting?
No. I've only ever done conference interpreting, but I'm a member of a group called the Public Service Interpreting and Translation Network Group in London because I'm interested and I'm their representative for conference interpreting. But there are lots of representatives of the Institute of Linguists, there's a magistrate in there, and that we are trying in that little network group to help raise the standards of training in public service interpreting courses. It's London Metropolitan that is the host of this group, and they're teaching this. And we're trying to find ways of increasing the profile, awareness of the needs of public service interpreters, and improve the status, because I know very well that the pay is not good, there is no regulation. People working in hospitals, I know many, don't worry, 2 or 3 of my friends, who, you know, it's just awful the way they're treated, and there is no understanding, or little, on the part of the clients, what an interpreter is, why an interpreter needs particular conditions, what training that interpreter's had, and how much money they should be paid. If I may, please just say that too. Because we in the EU and the UN, we're very well paid and we're very cushy. We live in a nice ivory tower with great protection and great working conditions, and I'm fully aware that my colleagues who work in courts and in hospitals and police stations and such immigration centres do not benefit from all these things, and I think they should do. But we're trying, a lot of us are interested in trying to use a little bit of the clout of the EU as well to push for improvement in the field of court interpreting. For example, EULITA, as you may know about EULITA, which is a EU directive aimed at protecting court interpreters, legal interpreters they call them. Now, which is a bit silly because I know that there is no such thing. Interpreters are conference doing court work, or their public service interpreters also doing court work. But at least, you know, people are aware, and a lot of people are saying to me, we need to do something more to raise awareness and to improve the lot of public service interpreters.